Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Annapolis, where we aim to inspire and empower all souls to live bold and compassionate lives. My name is Lisa Flaherty, and I am your worship leader this morning. We are a home for people of varying faith beliefs, as well as atheists and free thinkers. We are united by our covenant and by our belief that diversity is richer and more interesting than uniformity. We celebrate the inherent worth and dignity of every person, so we invite you to come into the circle of our community, bringing your full selves and all of your lived experiences with you. We especially want to welcome those who are visitors, either here for the first time or back again after a long time. Please identify yourself in the chat so we can welcome you more fully. And now let us continue our worship.
Good morning, everyone. I want to tell you a little story about a family who sometimes lights a chalice in their home. Perhaps this could be something like your family. You might light it during our time of worship together, or perhaps as you're starting a small group, or gathering with your friends on Sunday evenings. You might start it over a meal, perhaps. But I want to talk about this one family who started at a certain time. And, you know, even though it is this one family, it really could be any one of us. And I'm trying to figure out the names of this family. Zaria, are you there? I was wondering if you could help me think about a name for one of the parents in this family.
Right. Okay, there we go. Okay. I love you, Mom. I'm here.
Hi, Zaria. Can you help me think of a name for one of the parents in this family?
I don't know.
Well, what's a name that you really like? Maybe a name that you give, that you call someone or something that you really love?
Cotton candy. I like to call one of my stuffies cotton candy. That's what I like to do.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Zaria. And Amelia, there's actually two parents in this home. Can you help me think of the name for the other parent?
Me? I thought you said Amelia.
Amelia? Yeah, Amelia. Can you help me think of a name for the other parent in this home?
Because it's not me.
Coco.
Say it one more time.
Coco.
Coco. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Zaria. Thank you, Amelia. This is wonderful. So once upon a time, there were these two kids who were family, an older sister and a younger brother. And what happened was the younger brother was playing with this new fishing game when the bigger sister came along, and she wanted to play. And, you know, she kind of thought that her younger brother, with all his very, very careful extension of the fishing pole and the dipping it into the water to pick up the magnetic fish toys, she kind of thought, this is going to take forever to get my turn. And so right when her brother got that toy out of the water, the big sister grabbed it and said, my turn, and started to fish. And she didn't just pull up one fish, but she pulled up several. And the younger brother said, wait a minute, you had your turn. And she said, I'm taking the same amount of time as you. Now, just then, Coco came in, and Coco saw what was happening, and he said, no, that's not how we handle things in this family. In fact, when your mother gets home, when Cotton Candy gets home, we're going to talk about this. And the big sister went, ooh. And the big sister went into her quiet space to really think about her choices. And Then not that long later, she heard the door open and close, and she knew that Cotton Candy had come home. And she heard Coco say, "Children, it's time for a family meeting." And sister and brother came in and they sat down, and sister said, "We're going to have a family meeting now." And Cotton Candy said, "We're going to start that family meeting right now." And what did sister do? She popped up and ran out of the room. And she came back a few minutes later, and the family was looking from side to side. What is going on? And she came back in with her chalice. And in the chalice, they said, "What are you doing? What are you doing there?" And she said, "Oh, I am lighting our chalice." And they said, "Why are you lighting our chalice?" And she said, "Hold on. Let me say the words of our covenant." And so she said the words of our covenant. "Love is the spirit of our people, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, offer aid and affirmation. This is our covenant." And with that, she lit the chalice. And Cotton Candy said, "Why did you just do that?" And she said, "Well, at our church group," she says, "when we have difficult conversations, we light our chalice to remind every person to bring their best selves, their listening selves, their forgiving selves, their loving selves." And so I thought we should light our chalice today to start our family meeting, to remember to bring our best selves to this conversation. Don't you think so, Cotton Candy? And Cotton Candy said, "Yes, I think so." And so as we light our chalice today and go into worship, I invite you to bring your best selves to this space. Many of us need a reminder to find our center each week, to come into that ground of our being, to which we could surrender ourselves in trust and in confidence. It is in that space that we can experience the active, compassionate connection with others. This week, our thoughts and positive energy go to all those dealing with medical diagnoses, those who mourn and those who are ill due to COVID, those dealing with memory loss. We pray also for those suffering from oppression and pain. In recent weeks, our wider community, people across the country, have been mourning two specific individuals who contributed so much. And I want to lift them up today. The first one is Chadwick Boseman, who played Black American icons Jackie Robinson and James Brown with a searing intensity, inspiring audiences nearby, as well when he became the regal Black Panther in Marvel's blockbuster movie franchise. He died 2 weeks ago of cancer at the age of 43. His family said that he was a true fighter, and he persevered through 4 years of surgeries and chemotherapy, all the while bringing us films such as Marshall to Five Bloods and August Wilson's to Mama Rainey's Black Bottom and more. But it was really the honor of his career to bring King T'Challa to life as the Black Panther, to finally and fully see that audiences worldwide could finally fully see that Black bodies could be superheroes. We so often see them being heroes every day, but for neglect to hold them up. Whether it was James Brown's Get On Up, Thurgood Marshall in Marshall, or T'Challa in Black Panther, Boseman had this unfussy versatility and a kind of gravitas that really compelled him into being one of the leading men of his generation. But I think Oprah Winfrey said it best when she said, showing us all that greatness in between surgeries and chemo, the courage, the strength, the power it takes to do that. This is what dignity looks like. And I know many of you joined us in grieving this week when we learned about the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's so much to say about this woman and her filled 87 years. She was the second woman and first Jew to serve on the Supreme Court and was a pioneer and advocate for women's rights. Ruth Ginsburg was occasionally described as the Thurgood Marshall of women's rights movement. In part because of her days as a litigator and director of the Women's Rights Project for the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1970s. To honor these two, I share with you a poem by May Sardin entitled, Now Voyager. Now Voyager, lay here your dazzled head. Come back to earth from air, be nourished, not with that light on light, but with this bread. Here close to earth be cherished, mortal heart. Hold your way deep as roots push rocks apart to bring the spurt of green up from the dark, where music thundered to let the mind be still, where the will triumphed, let there be no will. What light received, now the dark fulfill. Here, where the music thundered, let the mind be still. Here, close to the earth, the deeper pulses stirred. Here, where no wings rush and no sudden bird, but only heartbeat upon beat is heard. Here, let the fiery burden be all spilled, the passionate voice at last be calm and stilled, and the long yearning of the blood fulfilled. Now, Voyager, come home to rest. Here on the long lost country of Earth's breast, lay down the fiery vision and be blessed.
Hear these words by William Stafford. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs, but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider lest the parade of our mutual life gets lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep.
The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said that human beings were promise-making, promise-keeping, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing creatures. This idea of promise-making is inherent in the act of covenanting. During my candidating week, I shared with you this idea of the promises that we will make to one another, of the covenants that we will form with one another. Yet, even though at our heart, starting with William Ellery Channing, who shifted us away from a theology based on beliefs to a theology or a group based in practices. He said, you know who we are in our souls, and God knows who we are in our souls, not by what we believe, but rather by what we practice. Ever since then, our covenanting has become the thing that has defined us. And yet, way too many Unitarian Universalists don't even know this about us. If people ask a Unitarian Universalist what it is that we believe, we often say, you could believe whatever you want, instead of, we actually are not a confessional faith, we're a covenantal faith. So far had we slipped away from this legacy that the Unitarian Universalist Commission on Appraisal decided in 1997 that the number one thing we ought to consider is this history of covenanting. In fact, they put out a report called Interdependence, Renewing Congregational Polity, and you knew I was destined to be a minister when I found this gripping reading. Nothing was more exciting to me. This idea that we were a promise-making, promise-keeping, promise-breaking, and promise-renewing people. Oh, how amazing to be so deeply connected to ourselves and our values. Yet I found since then, as I've journeyed in Unitarian Universalism, I've had plenty of opportunities to create covenants. In fact, many of you have done this if you started new small groups or gone into a workshop or taken part in some of those congregational exercises where we write a covenant of right relationship or a behavioral covenant or any of those things. And yet I found too often those covenants become papers that we hang on the wall, or papers that end once the flip chart of notes are taken at the end of a workshop. I want us to consider how we're always in covenant with one another, not just in a small group, not just for certain ways to say there are ways to be kinder to one another or behave better to one another, but rather there are covenants that we are meant to be living out with one another every day, every year, every decade. In fact, covenants that would really span generations. In my own experience, when I was serving at the All Souls Unitarian Church in Indianapolis, or as the youth director at First Parish in Concord, Massachusetts, I found the congregations that recited a covenant every week as part of their worship service. They were the ones who truly understood what it meant to be covenantal each and every day, spanning generations. And the reason for that is their covenant became a kind of discipline. We often don't have a faith that we think of as a faith with disciplines. And by discipline, I don't mean anything related to punishment, but rather as a spiritual practice that one conducts with discipline, that it's built into one's life, that you're reminded of it, that you've studied it, that it comes as familiar to you as breathing. I think covenants can become like that. And there are times when we are confused and we are lost, and we turn again to the words of our covenant that we know as familiar as some Christians know the Lord's Prayer. Now, in some traditions, there are the sacred texts like the covenant, and then there are the interpretive texts that aren't considered quite as sacred, and yet they become essential for interpreting the sacred. The reading by William Stafford, A Ritual to Read to One Another, that Lisa shared with you right before this sermon, I find for me is the interpretive text that helps me understand how to be in covenant. In fact, in those times when congregational life is getting a little bumpy, or there's a rift, even a kind of fissure between me and a community partner, I find these words of Stafford's come back to me and show me the error of my ways. They remind me of what it means to be promise keeping. See, I find Unitarian Universalists are great at promise making, and sometimes, though not too often, we do some promise breaking. And we have shown a tremendous value and capacity to be promise renewing. But I think we don't often talk enough about how to be promise keeping, what it means to know a covenant that well, and to understand how to keep it. So today I want to talk with you about how to be promise keeping, and why to be covenantal, and what we might say to one another to do this. William Stafford's poem, for me, answers a lot of the how. And I'm going to take you through the poem and share with you the how. He writes, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are. That's how he begins. And I find that that is where everything should begin. Knowing the kind of person I am, and I knowing the kind of person you are. This is one reason why I've invited you to come and use the little Calendly link to meet with me, so I can get a chance to know the kind of person you are, to understand what inspires you, what fears you have, what dreams you dream, and what are the yearnings of your spirit. And for you to come to know me the same way as your minister over the months and years ahead. Because when we fail to do this, Stafford writes, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. Too often, congregations are what I think of as culture takers. All the messiness and brokenness and cruelty in the world, we just bring right in these doors with us. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. I think about that phrase, the wrong God, and how a God in contrast to a star might be an ideology, a belief system, whereas a star is something concrete and shining that may guide us. We might think we're here for one purpose, but we could discover if we truly get to know one another, and if we set aside the patterns that others made in the world, we might discover a value that shines like a guiding star over our purpose. He says that there can be a small betrayal of mind or a shrug that lets the fragile sequence, and I'll put in, of interdependence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood storming out to play through the broken dike. How often does this happen? Somebody says something and we hear a resonance in the past, and we transfer all of the emotional weightedness of that past into this moment. And we begin to think, is this person telling me I don't belong or I don't have worth like I've heard in the past? Or is this another type of just little added water or pressure that lets us spill out all of that which we tend to hold in? And so we bring the messiness of our lives when we're not intentional about communicating in ways that are value-filled and loving and mutual. And as elephants parade holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. This line is the line that I have been struggling with the most in the 12 or 13 years since I first read this poem, in part because I can't decide how I feel about the circus and whether or not I want them to get there. But this idea of elephants parading, holding each elephant's tail, how often I've seen this true in congregational life. Someone will say something and another person will grab onto that thought and another person that one, and all of a sudden we're heading off somewhere. Sometimes the tail that we're grabbing is one of true leadership. And sometimes it's just that emotional fury, that sense of anxiety. It just behooves us to pay attention to which elephant tail we're grabbing as we're going off into the sandstorm. We don't want to lose each other, and we don't want to lose each other's way. Stafford writes, I call it cruel and maybe the root of all cruelty to know what occurs and not recognize the fact. I call it cruel and maybe the root of all cruelty to know what occurs and not recognize the fact. There are so many ways that human beings are not kind enough to each other, that we live in ways that are destructive. And so often we don't take time to really recognize the fact. We know in some part of ourselves that behind that little instance that there is a much larger story of pain and harm. When we practice covenant, we make sure to understand that when we live interdependently, when we live for one another, we must work to recognize the facts, recognize that when we know what occurs, but we don't take time to name it, that it is perhaps the root of all cruelty because it allows that harm to continue. And so he says, though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, for a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no, or maybe, should be clear. In order to communicate with this level of clarity, so that way each of us can continue to stay present in these important conversations, stay present to each other as human beings, we need to be not just clear, but thoughtful, discerning, reflective. We need to practice deep listening. He finishes, the darkness around us is deep. There is a lot of darkness around us these days, more so than I ever could have been imagined 10 years ago. And that is the why that we must practice covenant. The why we must practice covenant is there is so much darkness in the world, so much pain, confusion, cruelty. There's such an ability to get lost. And so we covenant So we don't, and we are covenant keeping, so we don't bring those patterns into our congregation, but also so that way we could offer a different way, a different pattern out in the world. And the what of covenant. To answer the what of covenant, I want to tell you just briefly an ancient story, the ancient story of Theseus and the Minotaur. Now, you might remember this story. King Minos was married to a queen, and he also had Daedalus in his employ, and Daedalus made these beautiful palaces and made King Minos the envy of many of his neighbors. He would regularly worship Zeus and pay tribute to Zeus. And Poseidon got jealous because King Minos was the king of Crete. And Poseidon said, I surround you, you should also pay tribute to me. And so Poseidon sent a beautiful white bull to be sacrificed by King Minos, but his queen fell in love with it. And so she constructed this wooden bull to be close to the beast, and they did not sacrifice to Poseidon. And so Poseidon gave a terrible curse. And the next child born of this royal couple was the Minotaur, a half bull, half man creature filled with terrible rage that Daedalus entrapped in what's called a labyrinth, but is actually a maze, a dark structure with no windows and lots of dead ends and circuitous routes that it was impossible to find their way in and out of. Now, King Minos failed, and his queen failed to do what was expected of them. The thing needed to bless their people. And King Minos said, we don't want to bear the pain of that decision. And so he would consistently wage wars so other people would pay the price. And perhaps people would forget that it was his and his queen's poor decisions in the first place. And so one of the things that he did was he would wage war, and he would require that these subject territories pay the lives of 7 men and 7 women every 9 years. 27 years passed like this when Theseus came and he said, send me as one of the 9 men. I am the son of the king, and send me instead. And Theseus went over, and it just so turns out that one of King Minos's daughter, Ariadne, fell in love with Theseus. And she went to Daedalus and she said, help me get him out alive. And so before Theseus and his fellow countrymen got sent into the maze, Ariadne gave him this golden ball of thread. And the ball of thread wove its way through the maze until it came to the Minotaur, who was asleep, who had fallen asleep. And Theseus slayed the Minotaur, and following the golden thread out, held carefully and intentionally in his fingers, he found his way out through the maze and escaped with his countrymen and headed back home. There is a lot of darkness in our world. I think about that, how life so often is like a maze these days, how we face one dead end and then another, how we're confused and don't know when this pandemic is going to end, how we're not given much of a blueprint, and how lives are actually lost, lives that, had leaders made other decisions, might have been saved. Such unnecessary deaths. And I think about the golden thread that Theseus held. That thread was the thread of love, given in love, that helped guide him through each. So I want you to think about how in the darkness you could hold on to the thread of love and have it guide you through safely. And like Theseus, who came and offered himself, offered to go in place of one of his countrymen, offered to put himself at risk, how he guided perhaps others out through the maze, their hands on his shoulders. Another act of love. I think love, if we hold on to it, it might be slender, just like a thread instead of a rope, but it might still be enough to guide us. And so I leave you with another William Stafford poem entitled The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. My dear ones, no matter the darkness around you, hold on to the thread that we know as generous love, and may it guide us out to safety altogether. Amen. On your screen, you will see a covenant. It's a covenant that I crafted using covenants in our faith tradition. And I invite you and invite us to try it on for a while, to see how it begins to weave its way into our thinking, into our practices of mutual care, into ways of being more interdependent with one another. Perhaps it is a thread that you could hold on to at times when you are struggling in your life. I invite you to unmute, recite it with me. Love is the spirit of our people, and service is our prayer. To build the beloved community, to seek the truth in love, to dwell together in peace, to offer aid and affirmation, and to live for one another. This is our covenant.